Welcome to Imagine Otherwise, the podcast about the people and projects bridging art, activism, and academia to build better worlds. Episodes offer in-depth interviews with creators who use culture for social justice and explore the nitty-gritty work of imagining otherwise. I'm your host, Kathy Hanneback.
This is episode 55, and my guest today is Shaka McGlotten. Shaka is a social anthropologist with a background in the fine arts. Their work brings together the theoretical insights of queer studies with the methodological toolkit of anthropology to consider new media technologies in relation to queer cultures. They've published and lectured on topics as wide-ranging as public sex, online cultures, pornography, gaming, zombies, human waste, voguing, and more. Shaka's first book, Virtual Intimacies, Media, Affect, and Queer Sociality, was published by SUNY Press in 2013. They are also the co-editor of two edited collections, one called Black Genders and Sexualities, co-edited with Dana Ian Davis, and another called Zombie Sexuality, co-edited with Steve Jones. Currently, they are at work on two book projects, The Political Aesthetics of Drag and Black Data, Queer of Color Critique Meets Network Culture Studies. In 2014, Shaka was the recipient of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation Award for Experienced Researchers, and in 2017 and 2018, they are a fellow at the Academy Schloss Solitude. In our interview, Shaka and I discussed the erotic relationship we often have to the things that we study, as well as how that always necessitates both desire and loss, how students can harness the power of Afrofuturism and speculation to combat white supremacy and climate change, and how queer and trans communities of color use voguing, drag, and what Shaka calls black data to imagine and create new worlds. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start with talking about some of your current work. You're currently a fellow at the Academy Schloss Solitude in Germany. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about that institution and the projects that you're developing there?
Sure. So Academy Schloss Solitude is a cultural arts institution in Stuttgart, and it's been there for, I think, 35 odd years. When it began, it was really a fellowship residency program for artists, but they've since expanded it. So you'll find other kinds of scholars and artists and people who kind of bridge the two like me there as well. The people are from all over. All of them are enormously creative. Many of the artists that I spent time with this summer would work in any medium that would help them get their point across. And I was literally blown away. It was inspiring in a way that even produced certain kinds of crises as I thought about my own practice and wanting to both return to more of a visual arts practice, but also the sort of changes that I'm making in my writing style, moving even more away from traditional academic writing than I have in the past, to think about kinds of writing that could extend beyond the text on a page. So moving things into the real world in the form of, material art, artifacts, or into the virtual world through web-based media. The fellowship was to work on both my drag book and my Black Data book, and it was very open. So the director, Jean-Baptiste Joly, was very clear, this is a place for people to come and think and work, and we could do anything or nothing. So I spent a lot of time talking about both of those books with people, laying on the lawn or sharing a coffee after lunch or walking in the woods. So Academy Schloss Solitude, as I said, really provided me with a space and some time to work and being able to interact with all of these amazing artists. And I've also been really fortunate recently to be awarded a Creative Capital Andy Warhol Arts Writers Grant, which when I applied, and I did this in conversation, as I was applying, I was doing it in conversation with all of my fellows at Schloss. And I was really lucky to be awarded it. And I thought it was a bit of a long shot as an anthropologist to apply for a grant about arts writers. But I learned maybe a week and a half ago that I was awarded the grant. So I've been super, super fortunate to get support for these various projects. And, 3 years ago, I was awarded an Alexander von Humboldt Foundation grant. So after, 18 years, I mean, it's funny that you talked earlier about having a career, and I was like, oh yeah, I do have a career now, like I'm in it. So
You do. You
after,
have a long arc of a career. It's very
yeah,
impressive.
I don't, yeah, it's like 18 years of working on some of this stuff. I'm like, oh, okay, I guess that I'm like a mid-career scholar now. But after 18 years too of applying for fellowships and grants, now I'm getting them, and I'm like, oh my God, this is so amazing. I feel so lucky.
So much of your work, both the projects that you're describing here, which I want to come back to in a minute, but also the other work that you've done across the course of your career, seems really at home in this intersection between creative art or visual art performance combined with activism and academia. And I'm curious what you find so fruitful about that intersection.
I discovered Trinh Ha's writing at the very end of my time as an undergraduate, and what she was doing blew me away, and it was the model I had been looking for my own work. And I think, so I was really lucky to encounter work like that, work like Avital Ronell's Crack Wars or The Telephone Book, people who were experimenting with form. And then in graduate school, I worked with Katie Stewart, and that was also, amazing. I also had the chance to work with Sandy Stone, and so I had models to work with. These days, I think it's not even that I find the approach fruitful, though I do. It is almost impossible for me to write some other way. I think, there are a few essays that I have out that are, more traditional, that don't incorporate so much of the personal, like book reviews. This paper I wrote on what we were calling copro power, like a piece about shit, basically. But most of my writing is what comes out and then is just revised sort of to death. But there is no, at this point, I've struggled with this in a way that I don't always want to write the sort of weave the intimate in, and I almost find I can't do it. And so in a way it's a disruptive practice within the academy, and maybe also an activist practice in its own way. I think about people like Fred Moten and Stefano Harni's Undercommons too now. When I first started reading that book, it bent my brain in new ways, and again, provided another sort of model for working and writing from some perspective that was within, but also lateral to the academy.
So I'd love to talk a little bit more about those books that you mentioned, the one on drag and the one on Black data. What are those projects all about?
So the political aesthetics of drag began in a way in a kind of on and off again gay bar in Jerusalem. And my former partner and I were at this bar, this tiny, tiny space. It was completely packed with tourists, with Ashkenazi Mizrahim and Ethiopian Jews, this mixed race anthropologist. It was a very kind of interesting space in a city, has a really funky and intense history. And we were watching a drag show, and the drag show was really familiar, right? That you had drag queens performing lip syncs, largely in English. And there was a moment where one of the drag queens, Diva D, sort of began to connect to the audience directly and asked, who are the tourists in the room? I didn't raise my hand. I wasn't brave enough, but this young German woman toward the stage was braver. And so she raised her hand. Diva D asked, where are you from? The young woman answered, I'm from Germany. And then Diva D did this really funny thing. She did a little goose step and a kind of Heil gesture. And then she just sort of softened and said, don't worry, honey, we're doing the same thing now too. And then she just went on to the rest of her drag show. So I was struck by this moment in which she completely upset our expectations of what an Israeli is sort of expected and even permitted to say in the contemporary political climate of Israel. And so that was part of the birth of that project, this way that drag could work not only with gender and thinking about the performativity of gender, but could make interventions in politics that were enabled precisely because of the liminal position of people who perform in drag. And so the other part of it, of course, was like binge watching RuPaul's Drag Race when I discovered that show. I'd never seen something like that. And I love the celebration of, people who are never made visible in mass media, namely femme and drag queens. So that's how the Political Aesthetics of Drag project began. And I knew right away that I wanted to work with artists and activists who use drag. So it wasn't going to be a comprehensive, revisiting of all of the conversations about drag. It was going to be something a little bit more like Christopher Isherwood's Berlin story, something more in the style of reportage. And the original concept was to work in Israel, Palestine, Berlin, and New York City. But sort of as my relationship with my former partner began to fall apart, in a way, the momentum of the project began to stall. And so I had to really rethink the project. And it's only been really recently, and as a result of really my students who encouraged me to continue the book. I'd really thought it was completely failed at this point, and I'd never done the New York field work. And they said, no, you and your former partner are already characters in the book. What if you told the story of the failure of the book, of the project, and the failure of the relationship at the same time? And the light bulb went off, and I thought, yeah, it's a great idea. And one, again, that I didn't think I would be able to come to without my students, who chided me for being too attached to form when I was always telling them not to get too attached to form. All right, that's a very long-winded explanation of the book.
But it sounds like that project has that kind of circuitous journey to it. So I think it works.
Okay, good. It's always like if you ask an academic, it's like they're going to talk for 20 minutes about something. I could just say the book is about activists and artists who use drag. That's the one sentence. That's the elevator pitch. And then the elevator pitch for Black Data would be something like artists who are working from a feminist or QPOC perspective, who are responding to changes in art and technology through their own work, and especially focusing on things like surveillance, biometrics, algorithmic discrimination, who are responding to these transformations, technologically enabled transformations tied to biopolitics. And the book is even more experimental. I'm hoping to work collaboratively with some of the artists. I imagine the book is somewhere between academic monograph, sort of a sketch of what these emergent media and these emergent technologies of surveillance are doing, and an art book, something that has a kind of aesthetic quality as an object. Both of these projects, art and art practices, have become really central to both of them, and is reflected again in the sort of my desire to move back myself to a visual arts practice.
Obviously, these are separate projects. They're two different books that you're putting together, but it seems like all of your work in these projects are kind of exemplary of this, demonstrate that these questions of technology, of networks, of data are fundamentally intertwined with these questions of art and performance. Yeah. And that's not a combination that a lot of people make, or not a connection that a lot of people make. And I think it's really smart and it's really intriguing. How does that work? Why is performance inherently intertwined with technology and vice versa?
I mean, as an anthropologist, I was trained to just pay attention to how people are using things. Right. So, and coming to intellectual age at the end of the 90s, all of those conversations that emerged from British cultural and media studies I'm still working with them. I'm still working with identity, with performance, with their intersection in political spheres. And again, I'm also just interested in the very basic materiality of how people are using these objects and interacting with one another as a result. Another way to think about it is various performance practices that I'm interested in, like drag, right? These are inherently, as performances, they are touching broader publics, right? So the performance isn't something that is isolated, right? That's the whole idea, right? It's something that moves out more broadly into the world, that has, ripples. So maybe a kind of concrete example would be useful. So I've been really interested in voguing over the last year or so. And there's already, Marlon Bailey wrote this amazing book, Butch Queen Up in Pumps, about the ball scene in Detroit. So I'm coming to this kind of late, and I owe a lot to people like Marlon who came before me. But, one of the things I've been really interested in with voguing is how this expressive form that really emerges from Black and Latinx queer communities is now exploding around the world. And some of that is happening through media platforms like YouTube, right? So this intersection between an ordinary performance practice and media has, always been part of what I'm working on. And there's another kind of levels with this. So one of the kind of main themes in the Black Data Project is this pulsation between opacity and transparency, right? So you think about redaction, right? Or you think about the invisible operations of algorithms and how they can shape people's lives. So voguing is, a case that I'm thinking about in similar ways. On the one hand, voguing is achieving a new level of visibility through the activities of the people who practice voguing, people who are part of ballroom scenes. And at the same time, there is something opaque, something that is not transparent about it. To really gain access, you have to become a member, right? And since, Madonna's Vogue and Paris is Burning and other people who've been looking at voguing as an object of inquiry, the ballroom scene has become, I think, more protective. They want to maintain a degree of ownership, a kind of ownership that hasn't always been theirs, even as they want to spread voguing to every corner of the world.
So you and I have known each other quite a long time at this point.
It's so funny. Yeah, it's like 12 years or
something like that. Yeah. And we met for the first time at a queer studies conference, go figure, back in 2005 in Asheville, North Carolina. And you gave an incredibly beautiful presentation that to this day, when I read it, it makes me cry. And it's called Desire in Ethnographic Research. And you were talking about what happens when we study the things that we love, the kind of desire that's baked into ethnographic research, and how that desire changes and morphs over the course of inquiry. And you were talking about your dissertation project, but this seems to be a theme that has come across in your books since then as well. And you pointed out that if you study the things that you love, you are probably also going to study losing them as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I love that phrasing, and it's incredibly evocative, but I would really love to talk more about that intertwining of desire and loss and how it shapes your work.
Yeah. I mean, when I was working on the dissertation, it was really obvious, right? I was trying on some level to write this celebratory account of histories of public sex in Austin and all of the ways that new technologies were providing new affordances for people to connect for love and sex. But of course, the longer I studied this, the more I realized that these histories were profoundly impacted by HIV/AIDS. People that I worked with were really still suffering, a decade or 2 decades later from the traumatic losses that they experienced as a result of HIV/AIDS. So, the closer I came into contact with that, the more intense it was. But of course, I had to work through that, both sort of intellectually, but there was no way for me not to work through it personally as well. And, the Virtual Intimacies book works sort of likewise. I document some of those histories again, but also just the ways that there is never, desire without loss. And it's also shaped, I think, by my spiritual practice, which is also something I've begun talking more about in my writing. In many of the Eastern traditions, Buddhism, Tantra, it's not just that attachment leads to suffering. It's actually not about not being attached, right? It's just understanding that attachment is always going to come with a feeling of either something not being enough or the transformations that, attend our attachments. So the beginning and end of a relationship, for example. Not unlike the ways that I'm writing now, I'm not sure there's a way for me not to do the work in this way. I've always found it fascinating and also a little incomprehensible in a way how some people will work with amazing topics and write beautiful books, that are really representative of an intellectual passion or interest, but that doesn't really address how they came to that work or what their personal investments are in it. A lot of my work has also been a working through of my own histories, my own experiences with trauma, a public working through of my own losses. And it was really feminist and queer writers who provided a foundation for me to work in these ways. So Audre Lorde, Gloria Anzaldúa, Sandy Stone in her own way. There are so many examples within anthropology, people like Esther Newton. She's one of the first openly gay anthropologists to do work on gay issues. People talking about love in the field, the ways that erotic and emotional attachments that are research subjects with the people that we study animate so much of our continued work on a topic, or even how sometimes we arrive to a field site. And there's so many anthropologists who talk about how as an undergraduate they went to X country and they fell in love with someone, and that their return, even if the relationship didn't work, was part of the impetus for their topic. And their topic could have been water use in Mongolia, right? But what brought them there was something more intimate. I don't think everyone needs to do this kind of writing, but I hope that some of my own work, like the work that came before me by all of these amazing feminist and queer writers, does give people some permission to do that. And I think that what we're working against in doing this kind of work, there are still, Esther Newton describes this when she was doing her field work as well. There is still a kind of skepticism about writing in a personal voice. There's so much debate, which I don't understand, about things like autoethnography. There are really sometimes snarky attitudes even toward memoir. This notion that, all of the work that's come, in this sort of post-identity moment, right? This idea that we're not, sovereign subjects. And there's sometimes a resulting notion that I don't think is necessarily true, that because we're non-sovereign subjects, biography doesn't matter, or memoir is like a bad form or an inappropriate form. And I just don't agree with that. I think you can absolutely do intellectual work through the personal, and there is no personal work without working through not just the heart, but the mind as well.
Do you have any advice maybe for writers who want to do more of this kind of work, this intertwining of the intellectual, the personal, the political, but maybe don't know how or are scared because it makes you vulnerable, right?
Yeah, it does. I wrote a piece that I'm really proud of, but for all kinds of this summer and for all kinds of reasons, I'm publishing it anonymously. And a lot of that has to do with the kind of cultural climate that we're living in. And it sort of goes further than anything I've written about intimacy and desire. And it's about pedagogy. It's about spirituality. And any of your listeners can email me and I'll send it to you, but my name won't be attached publicly to it. I think that people just have to do it. There are so many models out there. I think people should write the way they want to write. I think people should be reading really widely outside of, academic writing, which is so highly specialized. However inspiring it is in terms of thinking is, not really accessible to most, say, undergraduates. I think it is important and it is possible to write both in a rigorous way, in a way that attends to the issues that we care about as scholars, but also to write in ways that can reach an audience. And in some ways, working with the intimate is one way to do that. But I think my advice would be write whatever you want. Younger scholars, you might have to be more strategic about, as you're looking for work, how much you want to share because of the hostility toward biographical writing that you might find in some places. Do that writing in other contexts, a blog, other kinds of public engagements. Just know, of course, that, most people, this is sort of sad, but people on a search committee are not necessarily going to read the thing that you published in the Huffington Post, right? They're going to read your academic work. So I was really lucky, and part of that is probably about certain forms of male, in spite of kind of moving toward a more gender queer identity, I still inherit all of these forms of male privilege. And, I gave a job talk about public sex and gave people in the audience, including a dean, material to read from my project. So they were reading some of the discussions that informants had told me. And I got this job. So I think I've been super lucky. People in different subject positions are going to have different experiences with that. But I really think it's important to write what you want to write and to write in ways that enable people to work through something, to work through things that are both shaped by our intellectual concerns, but also by our desires.
So this brings me to my absolute favorite question that I get to ask guests, which is why I leave it at the end. Obviously, this podcast is called Imagine Otherwise, and you and the other guests that I feel privileged to be able to interview are doing just that, imagining and creating otherwise. And so my question is, what kind of world are you working towards when you're doing performances, when you step in front of a classroom, when you do this kind of creative writing, when you think about the kind of desire that's baked into ethnography? What's the world you're working towards? What kind of world do you want?
This is going to sound so cheesy, but like when I sit down to practice meditation, my intention, is of two parts. And some people have said it's actually the same thing, is freedom and love. I love the, however excruciating it can be, I love the practice of writing. I want to connect with the people that I am writing for, and I do feel that I am writing as much for other people as I am, writing for myself and working through. It's a form almost of service, of seva. I'll give an example maybe that is, addresses the question from the side. So I'm teaching a class this semester called New Black Ethnographies. And in the past, I've given students a range of work from that are not so new, like Zora Neale Hurston or W.E.B. Du Bois. And then they've done ethnographic projects that were amazing and brilliant about schooling and Black hair and Black businesses. But this year I took a different tack. I asked them to create Afrofuturist ethnographies, speculative ethnographies. That is, that they were writing and studying a topic as anthropologists from the future. And they could either conduct this ethnographic project in that future world in which they lived, or through a time traveling process come back. And each of them created their own project. So each of them imagined a different kind of world. Some of these worlds are really dystopian. Some of them are maybe post-peak oil. The world is flooded, but something interesting is happening. And I've been so inspired by their projects. One of the young women in the class is writing about the hydro noir. And the hydro noir are these Afro-descended hybrids who are the descendants of slaves who were thrown overboard during the Middle Passage and who somehow survived and developed these symbiotic relationships with creatures from the sea. And in this future, they finally kind of come out and return, and they return to this flooded New York and are working with QPOC activist groups. It's just, this is imagining a world. Another student is doing field work on this floating island of Afro-descended people that was made possible in some way by funding provided by the first Black female president, Michelle Obama. And this floating city is, moving around. It's a site for creatives. And so the students, they're studying a fashion show and these wearable clothes and things that are attuned to the world around them. Someone is working on holograffiti, the resistant practices of creating holographic graffiti. So whatever I imagine the world to be, I am so inspired by, the work of students like this who help me imagine otherwise.
Well, thank you so much for being with us and sharing your version of imagining otherwise.
It's my pleasure.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Imagine Otherwise. Imagine Otherwise is produced by Ideas on Fire, and this episode was created by Christopher Prasad, Michelle Velasquez-Potts, Alexander Sastre, and myself, Kathy Hanneback. You can check out the show notes for this episode on our website at ideasonfire.net, where you can also read about the fabulous guest, as well as find links to the people and projects we discussed on the show.